welcome to the Biddeford Parsonage Museum, historical residence of Lucy Maud Montgomery during 1894-95. Come in, relax, and join us for Storytime with LM Montgomery.
And just whenever you're ready.
Good afternoon, I'm Kit Loschiuk, reading the story, The Goose Feud, from the Biddeford Parsonage Museum. If anyone had ever told Mary Parker and me that the day would ever come when we would not speak to each other, we would have laughed the statement to scorn. We had been friends from babyhood. We lived next door to each other when we were girls, and when we married, our husbands' farms ran side by side, so that we carried our friendship unbroken unto our married life. Our husbands before our marriage had been merely friendly acquaintances, but soon, through our example, they became almost as intimate in their own way as we were in ours. Our children, as they came one by one, grew up and played together as much at one place as the other. We had a little footpath that ran past the barns and across the field from house to house, and it was kept well trodden. Never a day passed but I went over to Mary's house or she came over to mine. We worked in partnership in nearly everything. Nothing seemed complete to one unless the other was in it. We expected to go on like this till our deaths, and then to be buried close together in the little graveyard. One spring, when Mary and I were talking over our plans for the summer, she said she was going to try her hand at keeping geese. We had always kept turkeys before. I knew what kind of things around the place geese were, and I tried to talk her out of it. But she was quite set on it, so I gave it up. For I didn't suppose it mattered very much. It never came into my mind that such a thing as a goose could ever make trouble between Mary and me. I even helped her select the eggs for setting, and the mother goose when she bought one. When every egg but one hatched out, I was as pleased at her good luck as she was herself. Mary's goslings were all right until they began to grow up, and then she began to get into trouble. She put yolks on them, but that didn't prevent them from getting into the grain or wandering away to places where foxes could get them. I thought to myself that she wished often enough that she had kept to the turkeys, but she would never give in to that. Mary is pretty obstinate, in a quiet way, when she comes to take a notion. We had our wheat in the barn field next to the line fence that year. It was the best field of wheat at Meadowby. We had poor luck with our wheat for 3 years back, so we were all the prouder of this. William took every man and woman who came to the place out to show them that wheat and expatiate on it. One day I found all Mary's geese in the wheat. They had been in a good while and had made a fearful havoc. I was mad enough, but I drove the geese home and calmly told Mary that she must keep them out of our wheat. She looked worried and said she was sorry and would see that it didn't happen again. She said she had a real hard time to keep them out of their own and other people's grain. She couldn't very well keep them shut up all the time. About a week from that, I found the geese in again. It exasperated me more than I would have thought possible. I sent one of the children to take them home this time, and sent a note to Mary too. I know I'm inclined to be a little too rash and quick-tempered, and I suppose that note was not very conciliatory, but if Mary thought it was sharp, she never let on, but it was as friendly as ever. One afternoon I was sitting in the kitchen reading a paper and thinking what to get for tea, when I heard steps on the veranda, as if someone were in a big hurry and very decided. I had just got up when Mary came in without knocking. She had nothing on her head, and her hair was all blown. She had her underlip beneath her teeth, and her eyes were snapping. In each hand she carried a half-grown goose, quite dead and all blood-stained. Thinking it over now, I suppose she must have looked pretty ridiculous. But just then I was too much taken by surprise to do more than just stare at her. She flung the geese down before me as hard as she could and said, "There, I suppose that's your work, Lizzie Mercer." Her voice was shaking with rage, and she looked ready to tear me in pieces. I never knew Mary had such a temper. I I always thought her to be quiet and gentle. I knew the minute I saw the geese just what had happened, as well as if I'd been told. My oldest boy, Henry, had found those fatal geese in the wheat again and had taken the affair into his own hands without consulting me. For he knew I wouldn't have allowed him to lay a hand on one of Mary's geese for anything, much as I hated to see them destroying the wheat. Henry was always too hot-headed like his father, and never stopped to think of the consequences of anything he did. I was as sorry as anyone could be to see how Mary's geese had been stoned and mangled, and if she had not spoken the way she did, so insulting me as if I were to blame for it all, I should have given Henry cause to remember it with his death. Besides paying for the geese, of course. But Mary wouldn't listen to anything. She went on like a crazy person. I suppose the memory of the note was rankling in her too. She said things I couldn't endure, so I answered her back, and we had a dreadful quarrel. I'm not blaming Mary a bit more than myself. It makes me ashamed now to think of what I said. We stormed at each other over the dead bodies of those geese, getting more and more unreasonable. At last Mary went out in an awful temper and left me in one no better. I kept mad all night, but when I calmed down again and I repented of my behavior and felt pretty bad about it. Mary and I had never quarreled before, so I didn't know how it was likely to end. I knew Mary was pretty set in her ways, but I said to myself that as Mary began the quarrel, it was her place to end it. I wouldn't give in first. Perhaps she thought I was to blame on account of that note. Anyway, she made no sign, even though she must have found out about that geese. I felt dreadfully about it for a long while, and then I got cranky and pretended I didn't care. I said if Mary could get along without me, I could get along without her. We never spoke all that summer. There were always plenty of friendly folk to tell me the things Mary had said about me and keep me stirred up and bitter. It did not occur to me that they might have carried my remarks to her with a like result. But I could not deny I missed her. It made my heart ache to look at the footpath and see all the overgrown with grass. As for the wheat, I grew to loathe the sight of it, and a goose made me feel savage. At first our families took no part in the trouble. Our husband laughed at us and tried to coax us to make up. They were as friendly as ever, and so were the children. They played together as usual, and I was better to Mary's children than my own. I used to give them cakes every time they came into the house, and Mary did the same with mine when they went over there. I believed I had hoped that the children might bring about a reconciliation in the time, when another dreadful thing happened. Our husbands fell out. They were discussing our quarrel over the line fence one day, and got into a dispute about it. Each one upheld his wife, of course. They had a dreadful time. Every old family scandal for the last 3 generations was cast up. They even taunted each other with long-forgotten school day faults. Oh, I don't know what those 2 men did not say. When William came in and told me what had happened, I cried all night. I didn't know then how much I had hoped and had cherished that things would come out all right with Mary and me yet. But now I thought they never would. The men were even more unreasonable than we were. They wouldn't even let the children go and come. The poor little things wouldn't speak to each other because their parents did not. I took that to heart as much as anything. I used to lie awake at night and think it over, everything that had been said and done. Nobody had talked much about Mary and me, but when it got to be a family affair, people took it up. Somebody called it the Goose Feud, and the name stuck. It had a double meaning, I've no doubt, and the poor dead birds were not the only geese meant. The minister took in hand to better it, and he and his wife called one day. They didn't do any good. He seemed to blame me too much. I was too proud a woman to take it. Then they went to the Parkers with no better success. Then he preached a sermon about neighbors and church members living in harmony and goodwill from the text. Live peaceably with all men. He meant well, for a better man never lived, but it only made things worse. I felt that everyone was looking at me to see how I took it, and that touched my pride. Mary looked hard enough to bite a nail in two when she went out to church. As for William and Francis Parker, they were so provoked at the minister, they wouldn't go to church for over 2 months. Things went on like that for 2 years. It seemed to me more like 15. Sometimes I asked myself if our friendship had all been a dream. Nothing seemed real but our estrangement. I had given up all thought of ever making up. The things that hardened too long, I got over missing Mary's pretty much as we got over missing one dead because it had to be got over. There was always a dull ache. There was no footpath now, and Francis Parker had put up a huge snow fence back of their house that shut it from us altogether. I thought many a hard thing about Mary, but I was honest enough to own up. It was as much my fault as hers. Sometimes I wondered what would happen if I were to walk over to Mary's one day and ask her to forgive me. I pictured out our interview as if she would, but I never really had any serious idea of doing it. I suppose I thought more of that affair than of anything else in those 2 years. It was 2 years in July since our quarrel, and the fall after that, an epidemic of scarlet fever broke up in Meadowby. It was of the most violent type. Lottie Carr came home from town with it and spread it from her. My children took it first, but they had it very light and soon got over it. But other people didn't get off so easy. It was a sad time. There was hardly a house in Meadowby without someone dying or dead in it. It was more fatal among children, of course. It made my heart ache to see so many little new graves in the churchyard every Sunday. Someone told me Mary was in a terrible fright for fear her children would take it. She did everything to keep them from infection. She has 7. The youngest was 4 years old. They had all grown too fast and were delicate. People said Mary had got it into her head that not one of them would live if they took it. Then the next piece of news was that Mary had it herself and was pretty low. The other women went to see her. I felt it was dreadful for me not to go, but my pride was too stubborn to bend. Then Fred and the twins and Lizzie, who was called after me, all took it at once, and Mary had to get out of her sickbed before she was fit and wait on them and do her work. She had no help, and there was none to be got in the village. The neighbors went in when they could spare the time, but everyone had their hands full at home. Nobody knows what I suffered in those 2 weeks. All my old love for Mary had come back when I heard of her trouble, and I wanted to go to her aid. But I could not bring myself to do it. I wanted my oldest daughter Annie to go and stay at Mary's, but she cried and said she couldn't. They seemed worse than strangers, she said. Oh, I was worried dreadfully about it. Sometimes I talked about going at the table. William never said a word, either to encourage or discourage me. I knew as well as he did that he was ashamed of this fracas with Francis Parker long ago, and would give almost anything to have it wiped out. But he was prouder than even I was, in one way. I knew he would never put out the hand of reconciliation, but he would not put any hindrances in my way if I had felt inclined to. I didn't go, however, though I thought of it day and night. I went a great deal to the other house and helped wait on the sick and sit up and sometimes lay out the dear little dead bodies. All the sorrow and suffering around me helped to soften my heart. One morning, Mrs. Covey called in on her way from Mary's, where she'd been all night. She said maybe Mary's baby, little Dora, was down with the fever and was worse than she'd ever seen a child. I didn't see much, but I thought something burst in my head. When Jane Corey went home, I went upstairs to my room and sat on a trunk by the window. It was higher than the snow fence, and I could see right over to Mary's. The house looked so forlorn and desolate. The doctor's horse was tied at the gate. It was the second week in November, and everything was gray and brown. I remember just how Mary's windows looked through the bare boughs of the garden trees. I went over it all again, sitting there. I knew Mary was just wrapped up in Dora. I knew if anything happened to her baby, it would almost kill her. The tears came into my eyes as I see her bending over Dora's sickbed. I tried to put myself in Mary's place and see how I'd act if she came to me. It was satisfactory, but I was afraid to try it. I had found out how hard Mary would be, and I was afraid she would repulse me. That would kill me. I cried and cried, and Sophia Reed came in at tea time. I hadn't made up my mind. She said it was in her opinion that Dora wouldn't live through the night. That decided me. As soon as Sophia had gone, I put on my bonnet and shawl and went out. Nobody knows how queer I felt. I stood for a spell on the veranda to collect my thoughts. I noticed every little thing. The air was quite sharp. The sky was curdled all over with little rolls of gray-violet clouds, with stripes of faint blue in between. There had been a scad of snow in the afternoon, and the ground was grayish-white. It had melted about the door and was sloppy. The hens and turkeys were pecking around. The apple trees were ragged brown, but the other trees were bare and the leaves around in heaps with snow in their crinkles. William was fixing the pump. He didn't say anything as I went by, though he guessed where I was going. I went past the barns and struck onto the old footpath. The little feathery beads of bleached grass stood up wetly through the snow. Mary's turkey were roosting on the snow fence. When I got to the door, my heart was beating so that I could hardly breathe. I opened the door and went in. A thin, dragged-out woman with tears glistening on her cheeks was stirring something at the stove. At first I didn't know it was Mary. She looked up as I opened the door. Those few seconds seemed to me as long as the 2 years that had gone. She just said, "Lizzie." Then she was clinging to me and crying, and I don't know what I said or did. I soothed and petted her till she got calmer, and then I made her go and have a sleep, for she hadn't closed an eye for over 36 hours. By this time Henry was at the door. I had told him to come and get my orders if I didn't come back. I sent word to Annie I wasn't coming back that night, and that she must look after things and get her father's supper. Dora was no worse in spite of Sophia Reed's forebodings. Mary woke up at 9 o'clock, quite refreshed, and we sat up with Dora and talked over everything. Mary said I could have no conception of what she suffered from remorse and loneliness. She said she started more than once to come over and make up, and then the memory of something those kind folks had told her I'd said would rise up and stop her. I believe her feelings were a pretty exact copy of my own. About 12, Dora suddenly took a bad turn. I told Francis he must start right off for the doctor. Mary had borne up well, but now she seemed to lose all command of herself. She shrieked and cried and caught hold of Francis. She said he wasn't to think of going and leaving us 2 women alone with a dying child. She went on like that for as much as 15 minutes. Just as Francis and I were trying to soothe her and get her to listen to reason, William came in. I don't know how he knew the fix we were in. I believe he must have been hanging around outside. He said he'd go for the doctor. He didn't say another word, but Francis and he went out to the barn together to harness the horse. I never knew what they said, but next day they were working together as if nothing had ever happened. Mary and I had a serious talk that night. It almost seemed once or twice that we must lose Dora. But just as a long red streak showed itself against the sunrise sky, the doctor gave a long sigh and said the crisis had passed. Dora would live. Mary and I knelt by the bed with our arms around each other. The reddish gold of the sunrise fell over Dora's white face like a promise of hope. In the tears of joy we shed over her living baby, we washed out the last stain of bitterness from our hearts. That was called the Goose Feud, which was written under the name of Maud Cavendish and published in Arthur's Home magazine in April of 1897.